Welcome everybody to me talking about, well, my French. Well, actually talking about the technical aspects of i18 and l10. We'll get to that in a second. For now, I'm Andreas. I'm a PHP addict. I have a soft spot for dreaded things like dates, times, time zones, calendars, stuff like that. On a professional basis, I do run my agency. I do work on TeamUp, which is a group calendaring solution used internationally. I'm co-organizer of our local PHP user group in Frankfurt Main in Germany, where I'm based actually. I am an open source contributor. I'm a time nerd, yes I am. But also I'm pretty fond of things like i18 and l10. What is that? Well, i18 stands for internationalization because programmers want to be very smart and abbreviate everything. Internationalization is, well, kind of hard to say or to write especially, so we just abbreviate that with I. Then there are following 18 numbers, letters, and then an N. And with l10n, it's the same, like we just cut out 10 letters in between, and those 10 letters are localization. So we're talking about internationalization and localization. What is that? Most of the time, these two terms are more or less used interchangeably. Like whether you're talking about internationalization or localization, it's always kind of the same that we're talking about. But actually it's not. And so let's distinguish these two things and a third one that we need in a moment. What is internationalization? Internationalization is actually the process of designing a software so that it can be adapted to various languages and regions without any engineering changes. So we don't need to change code to get to a different, or to provide the application for a different market with a different language in a different country, whatever. And the actual process of adapting the application to this new setting, that is what is called localization, which is the act, the process, or the result of making a product suitable for use in a particular country or region. So the main question that you might ask yourself right now is, do I need that? I'm only working in one regional market. Or I do have one dedicated software per market. Well, then in that case, you probably don't need that. And if it's feasible or really fast to do, to kind of create a new dedicated software for a separate market, for a new market, why care about localization and internationalization? Because it is work. It requires a real effort on your side. You'll see that when we go through the different steps that are necessary for that. So why do I need that? Well, whenever you want your software to adapt to a different language, to some regional peculiarities, or you have some special technical requirements for a certain target area, then you definitely will need to think about internationalization and localization. Okay, different languages is kind of easy. I think everyone agrees on that. We know what we're talking about, but what, and also technical requirements of a target area, we touched that briefly at the end. It's kind of, I think everyone has a picture in their mind of what that means. But what is these regional peculiarities that I was talking about? Well, let's have a look at that. Regional peculiarities are, well, language, of course, we talked about that. Script, let's get to that in a second. Formatting rules for dates, numbers, money, phone, currencies, time zones, calendars, wait a second, religions, holidays, culture, network bandwidth. paper sizes? And there is even more? Oh, wow. Okay. Let's see where that brings us to. The main thing that you have to think about for when you're talking about or when you're thinking about localization and internationalization is there are two different approaches to certain regional markets. And one of those is we honestly appreciate you being here and we try to make your visit as pleasant as we can, which is internationalization. We see you, we want to make you feel home so that you perhaps spend a bit more money, but whatever it is, we want you to feel welcome. And the opposite of that is we provide you with the basic means to use our website so that we can make money from it. That is not what we're talking about when we're talking about internationalization. That is just, well, you could call it colonialization, but we'll get to that. So how do we do that? What is the kind of the smallest common denominator that we're talking about when we want to make someone welcome or feel welcome and feel at home? And the smallest thing that people came up with was an odd thing called a locale. A locale is a set of parameters that defines the user's language, region, and any special variant preferences that the user wants to see in their user interface. Sounds awesome. Okay. Have you ever come across a locale so far? Well, I'm pretty sure you have. Because, well, for me, my locale is DE, which means I'm speaking German most of the time when I'm not talking to you right now. And to be more specific, if I see a website, I not only want that to be in German, but I also want that to be in German as it is spoken in Germany. So DE_DE. Yeah. This format of a locale was developed ages ago. And that is the so-called ISO or IEC 15897 format. The full format would be DE_DE.ISO8895-1 at Euro, meaning German as it is spoken in German. All the strings that we have translated are encoded in ISO 8895-1, but actually it's ISO 8895-15 because we use the Euro sign as well. Yeah. There is a registry of these ISO codes, which is maintained by the Danish Unix user group. As I said in the beginning, I'm co-organizing a user group myself. I find that very interesting and very challenging that a Unix user group is actually maintaining that registry. Well, whatever. But there are other forms of locales. And you might have come across something like this, DE-DE. And the difference between the DE_DE and the DE-DE is one is the ISO one, and the other one is organized by the IETF, by the best coding practices 47, where it is defined, which in this case says the user wants German as spoken in Germany. And we have some user-specific add-ons to that, because they also want to use the Gregorian calendar and Arabic numerals. CA is calendar, NU is Arab, and there are some other options that you can add there in these for this IETF locale. But the most commonly used one, and the one that we will be using here in this whole session, and that you might be using in PHP most of the time, is actually the ICU locale, which also uses underscores. In this case, it is DE_Latin_DE at currency Euro and calendar Hebrew, which means I want German as it is spoken in Germany, but the Latinized version. Yeah, in German, that's kind of the usual thing, but we get to that where that might be different. And I also want the currency to be in euro, and I want to use the calendar, but the Hebrew calendar. We'll see to that in a moment. Yes, but as if that would not be enough, we also have the Windows locale identifier, which is specific to Windows. And yeah, in Windows they are just numbered. So the one that I want for German is number 1033. Yes, makes sense to know that, but there is no other way around that. But that's just for the sake of completeness. The thing that we will be using here throughout the session will be the ICU one. Okay, so far for the basics. Let's dive into the different separate things. So the most common one that we probably all know about is actually languages. And as you see here, languages are kind of very varied. What you see here is a map of languages used throughout different countries. And what you might see is that not all countries are firmly detectable. Like, for example, Germany is easily detectable because it's just this bluish blob. France is easily detectable because it's this reddish blob. But then we have kind of, yeah, Finnish is also easy to spot. It's the yellow one. If you look close enough, yes, Ukraine is visible as well, easy to spot. But if you have a look over at Africa, there are a lot of different shades of green, and all of them are different separate languages, but you can't make out a country out of that. Similarly, in Northern America, you have, yeah, the most of the United States kind of speaks English, but above that you have kind of Canada, where a lot of it is blue, which stands for English. But you also have kind of this slight red stripe in there, which is French. So there are countries that are speaking multiple languages. There are, well, countries that have a number of languages. And the main question is, for me, or that was kind of a highlight, was about the linguistic diversity. So the question is, how many languages are actually spoken in a country? The greener, the more languages. Yeah, that seems to be easy in countries like Germany or countries like Brazil. But even if you look at Ukraine, there are several different languages spoken. Even if you look at the United States, there are kind of different languages spoken. Most of those would probably be English and Spanish. In Canada, you even have more. Also, the local languages of the local people are also counted into that. And if you look at, well, Africa, you have dark, really dark greens. And there are countries around the world where you have over 100 different languages spoken. Why is that important? Well, because a lot of the times, if you visit a website and they have internationalized the website, they provide you with a language chooser, which is a flag. And a flag is not a language because a flag identifies a country. In this case, that might be easy. Most of the time that will be, yeah, I want English. But what in that case? Because in Switzerland you have 4 different languages that are spoken officially. It's German, it's Italian, it's French, and it's Rhaeto-Romanian, which is kind of a very obscure, kind of based on Latin language. So which language do you use? Yeah. So flags are probably a bad idea. And if you imagine kind of localizing a website for a country where you have 100 different languages in one country alone, that's going to be a challenge. So the best thing to do actually is to provide people with a language name. Sounds easy, doesn't it? So let's have a look at that. Let's go through this. So we have different locales, ENGB, UKUA, SR, RS, whatever. And for each of these, we want to have the language that shall be displayed. And there is this awesome function or method, locale get display language, that gives you the language for a possible locale and returns that in a certain locale. So in this case, it gives us the name, the language name, the name of the language for ENGB. So England, English as spoken in Great Britain, which is English. And for UKUA, it's Ukrainian. And for SR Latin RS, it's Serbian. So that's kind of Serbian, the Latin version as spoken in the Republic of Serbia. Yeah. But yeah, people in the separate countries, they might want to have that differently. So in Ukraine, for example, you would say, yeah, I want to display that in UKUA, so in Ukrainian. And you will get these three, please do not ask me to pronounce that, these three different strings that you can display and where people can choose from. And if you want to have that in Serbian, and I'm talking about the Latinized version of Serbian, you do it this way. And it gives you Engleski, Ukrainski, Serbski. So now people can select that if they know the language that they are displayed in here, which they probably don't. So perhaps the best idea is to actually say, yeah, you know what? Give me the name of the language, but in the respective locale. So I'm getting English, possibly something like Ukrainska, and Serbski. And that provides everyone with an easy to find language chooser. And you can do that from that one. You probably should also kind of order them alphabetically, but order them alphabetically on the output of the locale, not on the locale itself, because otherwise some things would be sorted oddly. Yeah. So that's how to provide a user with actually a language selector. Because that is the only valid way of a use of figuring out what language a user wants to use. Give them the option to choose from. I have seen people actually use IP addresses and figure out where they are based. Don't do it, because people are probably on a company intranet and the endpoint is in a completely different country, or they're using a VPN and their endpoint is in a completely different country. Yes, you can use the accept language header from the browser, but that might also not always be correct. The easiest way is let them select. Ask me what I want to read your website in. Speaking about reading, next part is, okay, now we know how to display that. Now we want to actually display stuff, so we need some translations. In general, there are two different ways of translating stuff. One is using gettext. Gettext is very popular. It's easy to use. It's the de facto standard for open source stuff. The drawback is it requires an extension on the web server, which might not always be available. It uses set locale, which has a drawback. Probably not that much anymore. The awesome thing is it allows multiple plural forms. What is a plural form? Well, let's check that out. In English, you say, I have one window. In Czech, for example, and Czech has multiple plural forms. In Czech, that would be one okno. Of course not one, because yeah, but my Czech is not that good. In English, when you have kind of two, you would say two windows. And from there on, whether it's 2 or 257 windows, it's always windows. In Czech, it's not. In Czech, you have 2 okna. And after that, when you have 3 windows, it would not be 3 okna, it would be 3 oken. At least I think it's at the beginning of 3. So they have different form of 1, a different form for 1, a separate form for 2, and from there on they use a third form. And gettext supports that out of the box. So you set the locale, you set say printf, or echo or whatever, n-gettext %d window or %d windows, comma, and then you set the actual value. And then you pass the value to the n-gettext thingy, to the printf, because you want the %d to be replaced. And then you get the appropriate string that you have in your translation, hopefully. The translation process is a bit odd because it requires you to create a template file from your source code, which is the so-called POT file. You then merge that template file into multiple individual translation files. So you have one translation file for German, one for Ukrainian, one for Serbian, one for whatever else you want. They are based on the POT file, and whenever the POT file changes, those changes can directly be merged into the PO file, so you don't have to recreate them all the time. When you have multiple of these PO files, and then you send these PO files somewhere so that they can actually be translated, and then you get the translations back, and then you compile those translation files into MO files. So these are actually binary files, and these binary files are then actually used in your translation. You probably see the disadvantage right away, which is it needs compiled files. Whenever the string changes, you have a changed binary file, which bloats deployments via version control systems. The other drawback is if you want to get professional translations, you probably use a translation agency, and they usually do not use getText. They use something separately. We come to that in a moment. A disadvantage is also it requires a PHP extension, and it relies on setLocale. Why is that a problem? setLocale sets the locale per process, not per thread. Which means if you are on a multi-threaded system or in a multi-threaded environment, for example, when you're using the Apache, the PHP module for the Apache web server, then it might happen that you get one request for an English page, and the English page, the code calls setLocale, and getText outputs all the information based on the setLocale. Everything's fine. But then, almost similarly, another request comes in for Ukrainian. And setLocale is also called now for Ukrainian. But this setLocale call sets the locale for the whole process. Which means the other thing that runs, the other request that runs in the same process for English, suddenly uses Ukrainian as locale. And you might actually end up in getting multiple different information, multiple different translations in one output. That is a bummer to debug. Believe me, I've been there. That is not a problem with PHP FPM, for example. That is not a problem if you're using, I think, CGI. So that should all be safe. Just have that as in the back of your mind if you run into such troubles. Oh yeah, there was something. Yeah, it can be a bummer. How to avoid that? Easily, well, either use PHP FPM or use xlif, which is the XML localization interchange file format, which is an XML-based way of getting file translations. You still have to kind of create the base file for that from your code, but then you can actually have multiple translations in one XML file. You don't need any binaries. It uses the XML file as is. And the cool thing is this is a format that is really, really common with translation agencies. So you can actually provide them with the file, they send you that back, translate it, everything's fine. It's a de facto standard in the translation world, and it's widely supported in the framework world. Symfony has supports it, Lamina supports it, Laravel supports it. If you're on some other framework or build your own stuff, there are a lot of libraries around that you can use, and if it's from Symfony or Laravel or whatever. And you also do not need a server-sided extension for that, which means if you're on a shared hosting environment, you can use that. How that is implemented depends on the used library, so I didn't provide you explicit steps here because, yeah, it doesn't help in that. Most of the time the documentation is really good, and so you can just use that. Of course, there are some other options. You can use database to translate the stuff if you don't need to export that. You can use YAML files. You can use third-party APIs if you are in for that and you want to have a request every time you need a translation. A lot of different options you have there. Yeah, and with that, we've solved the biggest part, haven't we? I mean, we know how to translate the stuff. We know how to get the languages. Everything's fine. Cool, isn't it? Yeah, well, there was this one sentence, perhaps you remember that. A locale is a set of parameters that defines the user language. We've done that. Region and any special variant preferences that the user wants to see on their interface. We didn't check in on those special variant preferences yet. To give you a short idea of what I'm talking about, what is that? Yes, it's a date. Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. But is that the 23rd anniversary of the terror attacks on the US? Or is it the 86th anniversary of the November pogrom in Germany, which was on 9th of November? Yeah, we don't know. Well, we kind of know. There is this awesome image on the internet, all the countries that are using month, day, year in the world. And it's not 100% correct, but kind of, because that's the actual distribution. Everything in this light blue uses day, month, year. I think the yellow ones use year, month, day. So still kind of a sensible thing. I think in the red ones, you can use either of those, but definitely the US. And I think two small things that are so small that you don't see them here on this map use this month, day, year abomination. But yeah, how do we handle that? So most of the time you will have kind of day, month, year, but sometimes not. Our datetime library actually is pretty clever. If you create a new datetime immutable object with 9/11/2024, it will actually format that as, yes, this is the 11th of September of 2024. And if you do that with a different kind of separator, like dots, it will understand, oh yes, now we're talking about the 9th of November, 2024. So that's kind of a way to do that. I get to that, how to make 100% sure that you know what you're getting in. But if you want to format something, there is this awesome thing called the Intel Date Formatter, which allows you to format something in a certain way. And it already has all the different locale specific things built in, which is unlike in date format, where you can specify, yes, I want the year and I want the month and I want the month with leading zeros or without. Here in the Intel Date Formatter, you just say, I want the full date or the full time, or I want the medium or small. You probably want to check which format means which, but how that is formatted then is completely depending on the locale, which makes sense. So you don't have to worry about that. You just need to worry about, yes, I want the full information or small information or whatever. So in this case, we are formatting in English full date, full time, for time zone Europe, Kiev, and then we just say, yes, hey formatter, do format this date, like today, 12 o'clock in UTC. And it provides me with Saturday, 17th of August, 2024, 3 p.m. Eastern European Summertime. But wait a second. we have this calendar equals Hebrew in here. That's not Hebrew. That's still Gregorian. Yeah, because the Intel date formatter is kind of specific. It needs to you need to explicitly tell him, you know what, I want the traditional formatting. And then it actually tells you, yes, today is Saturday, 13th of 5784 at 3 p.m. Eastern European Summertime, which is the Hebrew date. I'm not going to dive into the whole thing in calendars too deep. I touched that briefly, but that's it. So if you want to format dates, please do not use the datetime interface format because you will make it wrong. Use the Intel date formatter with their formatting constants. Well, the main problem that you have is when people actually enter dates. To get around that, actually use a date picker. Use a date picker to avoid ambiguity, like 9/11/2024. Is that US format or any other format? Date formatting done. What else do we have? Oh yeah, formatting, number formatting. Yeah, US formatting of numbers is 1 million. I think, is that 1 million? Yes, 1 million is 1,000,000.000. Awesome. Yeah, in Ukraine, you do that slightly different. You separate the 1,000 blocks with spacers and the decimal separator as a comma. But in Germany, we do that almost the same. Instead, we just don't use spaces, we use dots and the commas decimal separator, which kind of breaks with the English formatting or the US formatting, where the comma separator the comma is not the decimal but the thousandth separator. But I mean, the Swiss are even better. They still use the comma as decimal separator, but they use apostrophe for the thousands, unless it's for currency, because then they use the dot as decimal separator. And yeah, but the apostrophe still for the thousands, unless we are talking about official information, because then they are not using an apostrophe but a space. Yeah, but still, they are all kind of the blocks before the decimal separator. They are all in threes, in blocks of threes, aren't they? Let's agree on that. No, because, for example, in Nepal, they use the first block is 3, and then they're using blocks of 2s. Yeah, and the Canadian French uses a comma as a decimal separator, but the English, the French in Canada use a comma, and the English in Canada use a dot. What the actual... Yeah. But again, don't think about it. There is a number formatter. And the number formatter just tells you, you know what, I have this number. Well, you first create the formatter, in this time for Ukrainian, and for a decimal format. We actually say, yeah, we want at most, we want minimum 2 fraction digits, because otherwise it would just skip the zeros. And then, hey, you know what, please format 1 million. And it formats that according to Ukrainian formatting rules. And if you say, I want that in Swiss, German, then it does that according to the underlying rules. You don't have to think about that. How awesome is that? Number formatting. Formatting is the easy part. What about the input? If you have people actually inputting numbers, floating point numbers, decimal numbers, it gets really messy. Because somehow you have to figure out, okay, I mean, that was what would be one approach here. You know what? Get me the number formatter, and then format me a number, and then figure out what is the actual thing that is used for the decimal separator, and then check that and use that, and then in my input use the decimal separator, and all the other things that are not kind of numeric remove. Yeah, you see what I mean? It really gets messy. Probably the best way of handling that is doing something like this. Actually provide the user with a screen where they can enter the data and where they actually see what they are inputting. In this case, this is the user interface for PayPal. If they want me, or if I want to transfer money via PayPal, I get this screen and I know exactly, okay, whatever I'm entering now is like €1.35 and not 1,350 cents or euros or whatever. So that's the easiest thing. Which brings us to currencies. For currencies, also there is kind of a number formatter. Well, it's the same number formatter as before, just this time with a specific information. Yes, we want to use currency here. Again, Ukrainian currency, UAH, and then when you format the 1 million, you get that formatted according to the Ukrainian formatting rules. If you use the formatting rules for Swiss German, you get the 1'000'000.000 with euro in the front. So where the currency symbol is actually put is also a matter of these information that are available to the Intel extension. And with Ukrainian, with UK English, Great Britain English, you get actually the euro sign without a space and put directly in front of the 1 million decimal separator dot here. Yeah. I said I didn't want to dig into calendars. Well, I have to. Really sorry about that. Because one of the things that I've actually encountered was this here. And you see that, well, they are also using the slashes for the separator, for the date separator. But the most interesting thing here was the year 2075. This picture was actually taken on October 7th, 2018, Gregorian calendar. I visited a friend in Nepal and bought a yogurt there. And yeah, that yogurt was made on the 14th of the 6th month of 2075. Well, best is the best before, or the expiration date is also in 2075. So that would still be okay, that yogurt, would it? No. What I learned there was there are actually different calendars in use. And not only like in an abstract way, like the Islamic calendar that is mostly used in religious terms, or the Hebrew calendar that is mostly used in religious terms. These are actually calendars that are in everyday use. So I dug a bit into that and figured out, yeah, there are, in a lot of countries, we have the Gregorian calendar, which are all the countries in green. Then you might see these turquoise, bluish, greenish thingy. That's kind of they're using kind of a modified Gregorian calendar. The orange ones, well, they use the Gregorian calendar amongst others. The problematic regions are the red ones, because they are not using the Gregorian calendar. They are using their own stuff. And if you see, Nepal is that tiny red dash above of India. Yeah, they are using a separate calendar. Okay, how can we handle that? If such things occur, if we actually need that? Well, we create a new datetime, we create in a certain time zone, and then there is an Intel calendar, and we create an Intel calendar object from a datetime object. We create that with the Islamic civil calendar, and then we format that object based on the Islamic civil calendar. And it will provide you with Safar 11 1446. That's cool. And that makes things a lot easier, because we've seen there are some calendars, and yeah, the main problem though is the Intel extension ICU, which is the Intel extension is based on, does not provide all calendars. There are calendars actually missing. Like the calendar for Bangladesh, it's not there. The Nepali calendar is actually not there. So yeah, if you're doing business with those countries, you have to think about what to do. Where comes that into play? In holidays. And holidays are also a thing for localization because, yeah, holidays, of course, are different in each country. But not everywhere a holiday is also a free day. Also, not everyone is celebrating Christmas. And even if so, not on the same day. There are libraries that you can use to fetch or to figure out what days are a holiday, like Holiday Checker or Yasumi. I'm biased because I maintain one of those, but different story. But both libraries are actually missing countries. They are both open source libraries, so you can, and they accept contributions, so feel free. Another thing that you want to think about is seasons. And for seasons, there are no libraries available. Trust me, because I've checked the ones that are on packages and you don't want to use them, because they all are based on spring, summer, autumn, and winter, which is kind of, yeah, those are the seasons here. But there are other areas. And there are areas where you have 6 seasons, and or where you have 2 seasons, like dry and wet, or where you have 3 seasons, like cold, hot, and wet. And also, even if you have spring, summer, autumn, and winter, or fall and winter, how do you translate that? Well, even if you have them, they might be off because people are living on the other side of the world, where when it's winter for us, it's summer for them. Have fun with that. Think about that. That is not something that you can well, of course you can technically solve that, but there are actually not really technical solutions or technical possibilities to fetch that information. You need to know where the user is located to be able to understand what season they are in. But it's much easier to do that on kind of the business level side of your application. There are no technical possibilities to fetch these information apart from the country information. And then you have kind of cultural things that people might want to have translated or not. Like in Germany, we have the 5th season, which is Carnival. Nothing is working in certain areas there, but it's not all over Germany. In the US, you have Halloween, which might not be celebrated everywhere on the world. Or you have this Superb Owl thingy going on in the States, which kind of swaps over to at least Germany, Europe. Not sure how that is here in Ukraine. You have things like Black Friday, which to the US probably means something else than to Europe. And for these things, there are no technical possibilities to understand that and to incorporate that. Another thing that you need to think about if you're talking about internationalization is actually validation. What? Why validation? Well, because this is a perfectly valid Chinese name. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's Mao. So if your validation requires 3 characters for a name, you are in trouble if you want to make business with Chinese people. So please make sure all your forms and validations are in line with your target area. Names, addresses, birthdays, whatever. And now we're coming to another technical part, which is bandwidth. What? Why is bandwidth a thing of localization? Well, because not everyone is on a gigabit connection. Depending on where you're doing business, they might actually not be able to load your website because their connection is so slow that they can't read your information. You have to think about that. That is what I mean with, yes, we are doing our best to make you to provide you a pleasant view of a visit of our website. There are some technical solutions for that. You can think about the number of requests, the file sizes, use vector graphics instead of images, or use sprites because it only loads once and not multiple different files, whatever. So recap, internationalization is about incorporating local customs into your application. Internationalization is the opposite of colonialization. And it's not only a technical topic. talk to your marketing department, talk to everyone else, because some things need to be handled differently. For the technical side, rely on widely used libraries because it makes sense, like the Intel extension based on the ICU, or xlib or gettext for translations, stuff like that. And beware of localized inputs. And also always mind the gap, because there are and there always will be gaps in your libraries. Embrace them and also help close them. If you have questions, I'm in the chat. Feel free to drop me a line and I'll try to answer as good as possible. Thank you very much.
Good location, Andreas. Really, many thanks to your deep dive, quick and deep dive into localization, into this whole calendars hell. It was really interesting to think about it of this perspective, because as for me, commonly I'm working only with European formats and never thought about 2075 year in Nepal. It was really good. And you know what part can be covered also into localization hell. As for me, it is taxes. What about taxes? How to include them in price, exclude, work with them.
Thank you. Yes, I will include that in my next presentation, because you're absolutely right. That is a hell, especially when you're doing business internationally. Yeah.
Thank you. And just I have a good question about how to organize process for workflow for developers if you're working with multiple locations. How to do it really, really good. There's a question about work process workflow.
Well, the main thing probably is what you will be handling most of the time is localization files, like translation files of your internal strings of your application. What I usually do, and also see in other applications, is a separate folder, translations, localizations, name it whatever you want, where you have all these files that you might want to, well, either provide to translation agencies or translate yourself or whatever, and put all of those into one subfolder, and then have one process, probably during CI or as a manual process, that extracts the strings that you're using in your source code and that you need to translate, and puts that into these translation files. So that you in your source code you have like the gettext call that
Mhm.
contains a string. You grab that, put that into your translation file. Everything else happens in there, and then you just load these files from there. Is that kind of what you were thinking about?
Thank you for response. This is about translations. But if we are talking about not translations, if we are talking about localization, I'm not sure that it is possible to automate a process of it is possible to verify, to test it. So what about a process of Q&A? So
Yeah, well, I think the best thing there is, if you have kind of end-to-end tests where you are kind of
Mhm.
actually getting the website, um, perhaps try to have yeah different tests for different localizations. Like I'm sending
Mhm.
the request with localization one, and then I want to have the Ukrainian language back, and when I send it with another localization, I want to have the English text back. But I think that is mainly a manual process, and in essence, it's more about testing that you get one kind of string back, and then relying on the localization is working. But if you actually want to test that the localization is working,
you will have to do some kind of multiple checks that you actually get the relevant strings back, and expect them to break every now and then as soon as you do kind of change the translation because a translator spotted a comma that is missing and whatnot.
Yeah, it's really complicated and it's hard to automate the process. And just if we're looking from the developer perspective, should every developer know each aspect of localizations, or just the developer needs to think about one tokenized one language and just rely on other processes like translators who will provide them more information and fix it for them, or developer needs to understand localizations details?
I think as a developer, you always need to understand what internationalization is about. I want to separate internationalization and localization here. Um, so every developer needs to understand, yes, I have to think about these different date formats. I have to think about translation. I have to think about these things so that they can actually provide the means for the translator to then fill the gaps. So you don't have to understand and know how to translate all the files. Who cares about that? That's not my business. That's a translator's business, and they are much better about in that than I am. But I have to think about how their expertise can actually be part of our application. But yeah, not every junior developer needs to have a deep dive into localization. I think if you have established certain practices, like if you want to print out a date, use the date formatter. Yeah, okay, I don't have to understand why. I don't have to understand the details. I just have to understand I have to do it that way, period.
Yeah, it's really a good point of view. And just in term, you mentioned translators. When you're a developer, you're just developing a code. You have a big context of what you're using, and you basically understand your local language, for example, it's German, Ukrainian, and I hope that also developer understands and English. And if we are talking about context, developer have a good context of where he's using their translation. And if he gives just a tokenized translations to the translator who don't have a big context of where it is used. So maybe you will suggest some best practices how to localize or translate correctly and work with this.
Yeah, that is indeed a good point. We all have probably seen mistranslated things because a translator didn't get the context for anything. Um, there is actually not really a good way of doing that, because everything that you can kind of do for automation is based on, yes, you have this token and you pass this token to the translator. It's easier for the translator to actually translate a whole sentence because then they can kind of understand what is going on. If you just translate one word in a button, that can, yeah, you can get the wrong information there. What I've done actually was adding some comments to these translated strings so that in the process of extracting the tokens from my source code, was also able to grab this comment and pass that onto the translation file so that in a specified way, depending on what systems you're using, so that the translator could actually get that information and get a bit more context. Another possibility would be, but that's again a manual process, to also include kind of screenshots of where the translated string appears on the website, so the translator knows in what context we are dealing here. But yeah, with a big website, that can become really tedious.
And there is one more problem with even if you provide comments and even if you provide screenshots, UI can be broken on different translations. How to work with that? So, just from your experience.
Yeah. The topic of strings that are too long. German is very famous for being much longer than English, for example. So you have your amazing user interface that works well with a one-line headline, and then you translate that into German, and you suddenly get a two-line headline, and yeah, everything's boring. Um, Actually, there is almost no way around that from the translation point of view. That is actually something that the UI designer needs to take into account, that there's the strings they are using might be different. I've actually had that. I worked in print previously, where that is much more a thing, where I had awesome graphics designers design templates with date headline in there. And of course, for testing, they used 1st of May 24. And then, yeah, okay. And then at one point, we got that template, and then we were like, have you ever tried 31st of November 2024? And suddenly the whole thing blew up. That is not something that you can do on a technical basis. That is actually something that the designer needs to think about. What do I do when the string is longer than this? What do I do when the string is shorter than this? Perhaps that might also make a difference. And then the translators usually are able to kind of stay within the character limit. So if you get, I don't know, 20 or 30% plus or minus of the character length in English, that usually works. But if you think about especially translating into completely different languages with different scripts, like Korean or Japanese or Chinese, um, suddenly everything is different, because, not only are they sometimes writing not from left to right, but from right to left, or from top to down, or whatever. Also, you have kind of suddenly one character per syllable, and not anymore per, well, letter. So if you're doing that, you have to think about that, and that is a part of the UI design to actually incorporate and implement.
Yeah,
Thinking of it, I
it's
should.
really
No, no, go
yeah,
ahead.
but yeah, and I was thinking my next question will be also based on previous ones. Have you ever tried AI in a process of automatization your translations? Because you can give him a big context, so much bigger than you can provide for a translator, and AI can understand really what you are doing. So, and you may possibly automate the process, specify even attributes with max character length and so on.
To be honest, no, I never thought about that. Um, I'm not 100% sure that AI is actually able to manage that, um, because you will always require someone that goes through the translations afterwards and checks whether they are actually valid. But most of the time, if you pass the translation process on to an agency, they might actually use something like that. I definitely know that they have systems where they kind of have pre-translated sentences. So they see, oh yeah, this is a sentence that we've translated 5 times already, so I'm automating the translation already. And then the translator only has to check, is that valid or not? But it's a good point. I've never thought about that. I will do that. Think about it, not
Yeah,
use it.
because as for me, it's really will be more. It will be faster for developing a website when the developer has a bigger view. So just you give him a lot of different translations, and he can easily use them and understand what he can do with it. And even for UI designers, so you can change the process of translating by stepping it before development and using it in development. And then still, even after localization, even after agencies, you need to check and verify that everything is really working good into your project and on your devices. Yeah, it's really hell.
Yeah, but that's really a good idea, actually. As I said, I never thought about that. I will definitely have a look at that, because yeah, it might make sense to use AI and just, yeah, that's what I have. How would you translate that kind of? Or how would you
Yeah, and
automate that? Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting because translations is really, from the one hand, is um, as for me, it is one of the best tasks for LLMs because it's really easy to do for them and they cover a lot of things on the one hand, and maybe we'll automate this process in future and minimize the costs. And about minimizing the costs, I just wonder, you show that US have different date format, and do you think is it really possible to migrate one date format for at least most of all countries all over the world, or it is not possible at all?
Well, actually, we already have one date format for all the countries. There is the ISO.
Hmm.
Which one is that? I have too many ISO numbers in my head. 8601. I don't know. There is an ISO standard for date formatting, which is kind of
Hmm.
go from the biggest to the lowest. So kind of the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minute, the second, the millisecond. That is kind of a
Hmm.
standardized way, and all countries are using that way, except for the US. And I think two or three smaller ones that we do not need to talk about, because we are talking about, I don't know, 100,000 people or something like that. So who cares about that? But we actually have this standard. The,
Hmm.
in some countries, they are also then using a different kind of way, like day, month, year, but it's always like in the same. You go either from the biggest to the smallest, or from the smallest to the biggest, but not like, yeah, we are doing the smallest, and we are doing the medium, then the small, and then the big. Like, what? Why?
Yeah,
But
it's really
as
ridiculous.
as that is a matter of the local government, um, I think it is very, very hard to actually get people to transition, because yeah, that's our kind of our way of expressing that we are special.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And just in your presentation, you mentioned about that IP is not a cure way to detect a local of a person. But
Yes.
maybe you suggested that you can detect it by accept language, but from my experience, for example, we are making food delivery service in Ukraine, and we are guessing the city of user by detecting his IP and bypassing his IP. And more than in 95% of cases, we guess the city of the user, right? So maybe it is really a cure way to detect, or just maybe your suggestions how to determine which locale is for user.
Well, yes, you will be right in definitely 90% of the cases. You might even get to 95% of the cases. I had the problem that, but it always depends on your business case. I had the case that we detected it wrongly in, I don't know, 90% of the cases, because we built a website for an international company. And we also thought, yeah, we are clever. We are doing the localization based on the IP address, until we realized that they are using an internal VPN, and the VPN endpoint was in Germany. So everyone got German localization, no matter where they were, because, yeah, the wrong IP address. So that doesn't work. You have to think about that. The easiest way to actually pinpoint the location of a user is using the location interface of the web browser. But yeah, that requires the user to actually allow that. It depends on your business use case. So you might, if you're fine with, yeah, I'm getting 90% or 95% of my users correct, and the remaining 5 or 10% I don't either care or provide them with means of changing that manually, that's fine, cool. If you're not, then use that technique. If you're not happy with that situation, then you need to think about something else.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And just do not overcomplicate. If it is correct, if it is working for your business, use it. And just of this case, to be honest, most of our businesses working with 2 or 3 locales, not more. How to know, because today we spoke about a big thing of localization. When I think about, wow, I need to do this. Oh, we are not covering that cases. But how to not overcomplicate, how to do it in the simplest way as possible.
If you are developing your business for one country, like Ukraine, stick with that. There is no need for translation because you know what's going on. That is something to think about as soon as you start um, getting broader and kind of expanding into other countries. In that case, you have to think about that. And then it doesn't matter whether you kind of think about it on a small scale or on a big scale. You have to think about it. But if you're fine with, I have my local business in whatever, in Kiev, and I'm not even caring about the next city. Why do you want to invest a lot of time and also money into doing awesome internationalization that you will never need? That's like, yeah, I have to prepare for running on Kubernetes for my small blogs website that gets 10 visits a month. There is no need for that. But you have to think about that. You have to need to know about what are the processes to make an informed decision. Do I need it or do I not need it? And yes, if you're not needing it, that's fine. That's what I said at the very beginning. If you're not doing business with other countries, don't care about it.
Yeah, it's really good point, Justin. Do not overcomplicate the things. Just do it. Start from scratch, and then when there would be cases, it will be a good time to use it, because most of all startups failing. So, and not due to problems with localizations.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You have an awesome Kubernetes based website with internationalization for 356 countries and fail after 2 months. Yeah, awesome. Why?
it's definitely not the problem of localization. Yeah, Andres, thank you once again for coming and giving us a quick and deep dive into internalizations. And we are really give you an excuse for your French. It's really good.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope to visit you at one point in real life.